First question is, did stretching enhance my athletic career? Let's be realistic. Number 32 up there, aka me, did not have a spectacular professional football career. In fact, one might say that I had a cup of coffee in the Canadian Football League. So I went to training camp, I played one game, got cut. So why didn't anybody want to pay me to play football? Well, there could be a number of factors, but one of the main factors, at least in my opinion, was I didn't have that breakaway speed. And you need to have that burning speed to be a good running back. So what are the components of speed? There's two components, stride rate, stride length. Now, stride rate is a frequency at which you can move your legs back and forth. And stride rate is highly dependent upon the percentage of fast twitch fibers you've got in your legs. Now, the percentage of fast twitch fibers you have in your legs is highly dependent upon your genetics. So what did your parents pass on to you? Did you pick the right parents? Right? Unfortunately, I did not pick the right parents. I ended up being slow. Now, the second component is stride length. Fortunately, stride length can be altered by training. So if you work on your explosive strength and your power, you can explode off the ground and cover a greater distance with each stride. So knowing that, when I was a football player, I worked very hard on my strength, and I could squat over 500 pounds. Now, there's a notion as well that if you have limited flexibility, that would hamper your stride length. So based on that notion, I worked really hard on my flexibility, and I could do the splits. Now, I was going to demonstrate tonight, but then I remembered that was 35 years ago. Right? So I worked hard on my strength, I worked hard on my flexibility. I still wasn't fast enough to be a professional football player. So where did we get this notion that flexibility or stretching would enhance performance? Well, perhaps it's an evolutionary type of thought. If you take a look at some of the animals, you see that animals stretch. Right? In fact, our top of the food chain, Lottie, our pet Boston Terrier, stretches every morning. Forelimbs, hind limbs. And does she think it's going to do anything for her? Does she think that she's going to get out there and she's going to catch that neighborhood rabbit for the first time? I don't think so. Well, maybe we'll look at one of our other ancestors, maybe the early hominids. Did they do extensive static stretching before they went on the hunt? Would that have allowed them to catch the mastodons better or the mammoths? Or maybe it would have allowed them to run faster away from those saber-toothed tigers. Well, how about medieval times? Did medieval swordsmen do a lot of static stretching in preparation for battle? We don't know that. But what we do know is that in the World Wars, it was the first time they started systematic investigations into human performance. And if you will go to a fitness facility and the fitness consultant says to you, well, let's get started. We're going to have you do 3 sets of 10 repetitions of bench press. And when you're finished that, we're going to get you come on over here, and you're going to do 3 sets of 10 repetitions of bicep. You can thank a guy named Colonel Delorme. And Colonel Delorme was in the U.S. Army, and he was the first one to take a look at the most efficient ways of promoting strength and endurance. Well, it wasn't just the U.S. Army. The Royal Canadian Air Force also came up in the late 1950s and early 1960s with the 5BX plan. And it was by Dr. Bill Orban, another Canadian. Now, 5BX stood for 5 basic exercises. And what it was supposed to do was supposed to allow the military personnel to be more fit when they didn't have equipment or facilities to work out. So with the 5BX, you probably remember one of those exercises if you've ever seen any of the old movies. You probably saw some of those military personnel standing up there, fingertip to fingertip. And there'd be a sergeant in front, and the sergeant would say, okay, let's get going, and a 1, and a 2, and a 3. And you'd be bouncing up and down. Now, what was the purpose of doing that? Well, the purpose was supposed to build up your core strength and your trunk strength, and was also supposed to increase the flexibility of your lower limbs. There's a problem, though, with that kind of exercise, and it had to do with what's called your myotatic reflex. Now, your myotatic reflex, if you've ever been to the doctor, and the doctor takes your knee, hits the patellar tendon, and you get that reflex going, when you do that, there's what's called a muscle spindle in your muscles, and it tells you that your muscle's being stretched. it sends a message back to your spinal cord and activates that motor neuron and says, contract that muscle. Well, inside that muscle spindle, there's two components. There's what's called a nuclear bag fiber, and there's a nuclear chain fiber. Now, the nuclear bag fiber tells you the rate at which you're stretching the muscle. So you can imagine where they're going boom, 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 that's a fast rate. So a high-frequency signal goes back to your spinal cord and makes that muscle contract. The nuclear chain fiber, it tells you the extent that you stretch your muscle. So going all the way down to your toe is quite a ways for that muscle, and there's another high-frequency signal comes back to that spinal cord and makes it contract. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to stretch that muscle, and yet the reflexes are trying to contract that muscle. So you've got two opposing forces. That's a recipe for injury. So where did we go from there? Well, what we changed to after the early 1960s is we changed to static stretching. And static stretching became the mainstay of the warm-ups for the next 30 years. So why would we do static stretching? Well, what is static stretching? Well, static stretching would be, instead of bouncing, I would reach forward nice and slowly, and I would hold that stretch. Now, what that does, remember I said the nuclear bag fibers, they sense the rate. Well, if I go slowly and hold it, there's no rate, so the bag fibers don't fire. Remember I talked about the nuclear chain fibers. They tell you the extent. Well, of course, they fired when I first stretched, but if I hold this stretch for 30 or 60 seconds, they turn off too. So now what I've got is I've got a muscle that's starting to relax. And instead of reaching this far, I can reach farther and farther and farther and farther. Right? Not bad for a guy who's almost 60. All right? So, static stretching was a mainstay for 30 years. Now we came to about the late 1990s or the early 2000s. And there's some research coming out by people named Kokkonen, Jonathan Fowles from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, and they started to show that maybe there's impairments in your performance if you do static stretching. So from that time on, there's a multitude of studies that came out during the next 12 years or so. So we published a review study in 2011. And in that review study, we showed that when you take a look at all the studies that were published during that time, you see in the graph that the majority of them provided impairments to force and power. And how much impairments? Well, we found in the studies we looked at, it was about 5%. Right? There's another review that came out after ours by a couple of people named Kay and Blažević. They're from Australia. And fortunately, they came out with almost the exact same findings. They said that it was about 7.5% impairments based on the studies they looked at. So we were both in the same ballpark, which is kind of nice because we're not contradicting each other. So 5%. Now, if you look at running doesn't give you the same picture. The running studies, most of them don't show significant impairments. Why is that? Well, it's because there's all sorts of different kinds of running. You can be sprinting, you could be running a marathon, you could be just jogging for health and fitness, and they're all going to be quite different in the terms of the speed you're going, the power that you're doing, and the time that you're on the ground. So let's say that you are Usain Bolt, and you're sprinting in the Olympics. Well, Usain Bolt is like a high-performance machine. And in fact, you might want to compare him to a Ferrari. All right? A Ferrari has tight suspension. A Ferrari hugs the road and reacts very quickly to the road. And that's exactly what an elite sprinter has to do. An elite sprinter, when he lands on the road or the track, he's only on that track for 100 to 150 milliseconds, even less than that. That's 1/10 of a second. So in 1/10 of a second, he or she's got to land, the muscle has to stretch, and then when they take off, they want that muscle to snap back and give them extra energy. So they want their muscles to be fairly tight, just like the suspension on a Ferrari. This person would be a lousy sprinter. This person has very compliant muscles, tendons, and ligaments. So if this person was sprinting, their muscles, tendons, and ligaments would absorb all those forces. So he wouldn't get the extra force. So what if you're just interested in jogging for health and fitness? What should you do? Well, you should consider yourself a Cadillac, because Cadillacs have soft suspension. You're driving a Cadillac here in Newfoundland or anywhere in Canada, and you're driving in the springtime and you hit a pothole, what does a Cadillac do? It goes, ooh. It absorbs the shock. If you're driving a Cadillac, you don't feel anything going up your back. If you're driving that pothole in a Ferrari, you'd feel every pothole in the road. But a Cadillac is nice and soft. And that's what you want your body to be if you're considering your joints. You want your muscles and tendons to absorb the forces, so your joints are taking a lot of beating. If you're an elite athlete, then you might compromise your health for performance. Elite athletes are not always the epitome of health. If you have tighter muscles and tendons, then you've got more strain on your joints. Now, we talked before that you have about a 5% impairment with static stretching. This is the face of 5%. This gentleman here was a sprinter in the 2012 Olympics. That's the Olympics that Usain Bolt won the gold medal in 9.63 seconds. This person here was 5% slower. Do you recognize him? I don't think so. So if you don't recognize him, he probably didn't win a silver medal. He didn't win a bronze medal. So did he come in 4th place? No. Did he come in 6th place? Not even close. He didn't even come into the finals. I'll introduce you to Mr. Gerald Feary of Zambia. Mr. Gerald Feary of Zambia ran in 10.11 seconds. That's only 5% slower than Usain Bolt. He came in second last in the semifinals. He was in 15th place in the semifinals at only 5% slower. 5% is the difference between celebrity and anonymity. And it cost this guy millions of dollars. Millions of dollars. So, are there any athletes that should be doing static stretching before their performance? Well, you'd imagine that a hockey goalie needs an extensive range of motion to do the splits and to do the butterfly. How about a gymnast? How about a figure skater? Well, even the sprinters I talked about, what they want to do is they want to get in the Goldilocks zone. So what's a Goldilocks zone? Well, Goldilocks zone is you want to have muscles that are just tight enough so they give you an efficient transfer of energy when you hit and go. But you want muscles that are just flexible enough so it doesn't impair your stride length. So how do you accomplish that? Well, in that same review that we talked about before in 2011, we looked at the duration of stretching and its effect on force and power. And as you can see here, it's extensive static stretching that impairs your performance. If you do static stretching that's less than about 30 seconds in duration per muscle group, then there shouldn't be any significant problems with your performance. So you could do 3 stretches of 8 seconds each. You could do 4 stretches of 6 seconds each. Combine that with some dynamic stretching, and you should be fine. You should be able to be in that Goldilocks zone. So what's our point? Well, our point is 95% of you people are Cadillacs. All right? You're more interested in the health of your joints and your fitness. And therefore, just like this guy who's golfing, you're not worried about that 5%. This guy, if he hits the ball 5% slower, who cares? It's not going to make any difference to his game. So if the only time that you can do stretching is before you go play golf, tennis, squash, go running, go right ahead, because it's good for your health. But if you're Sid the Kid and you're the Ferrari, then what you've got to worry about is being too compliant. So you want to get in that Goldilocks zone. You want to do some dynamic stretching, but if you want to do some static stretching, you only want to do less than 30 seconds per muscle. So I want to end off with a quote from a famous exercise physiologist, and it goes something like this. It goes, to stretch or not to stretch? That's the question. And hopefully, after this presentation, you've got all the answers. Thank you very much.